Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tamara Heiler, and I'm the Director of Education here at Third Way. Thank you so much for joining today for what I am positive is going to be an incredibly insightful conversation with Congresswoman Donna Shalala, who, for those of you who may be less familiar, represents Florida's 27th district, which, as you can see by her beautiful background, includes the city of Miami, as well as some surrounding municipalities of Miami-Dade County. This conversation is actually the first of a handful of conversations that the Third Way Education team will be launching over the next few months, in which we will be engaging influencers and thought leaders in the conversation that's happening around higher education, as well as the federal response to coronavirus. Clearly, there is no sector right now that is completely immune to the fallout of this pandemic, but I do think that it is safe to say that higher education in particular is facing a pretty unique set of challenges as it's trying to figure out how it can best serve students and stay or remain afloat in an environment in which there is just so much uncertainty about the future. But before we officially kick things off, I want to first go over a few logistical details with everyone listening in. First, the hope is for today to have everybody ask questions of Congresswoman Shalala if you have them. But in order to do so, you will need to use the chat function that is at the bottom of your screen. I have some questions that I've prepared that I will go through first, but we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the conversation, and we'll make sure to leave time for further questions at the end. I also want to note that this conversation will be recorded, so if there are things you miss or will want to reference again, you will be able to do so at the link that we'll post on Third Way's website after the conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to very quickly introduce Representative Shalala, whose credentials are quite impressive and inspiring, and this is all before becoming or being elected to Congress in 2018. So notably, the Congresswoman has had a very storied career in higher education, as she served as president of Hunter College of the City University of New York, chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and president of the University of Miami. The Congresswoman also has an extensive background in public service, including serving under multiple presidents, most notably serving for 8 years as Bill Clinton's Secretary of Health and Human Services, where she created, implemented, and oversaw the Children's Health Insurance Program, and where she succeeded in doubling the budget of the National Institute of Health and secured the highest immunization rates in American history, which of course is highly relevant to today's circumstances. So as you can see, there is simply nobody who is better suited to have a conversation about the nexus between higher education and the federal government's response to helping students and their families weather a pandemic than the Congresswoman herself. So with that, thank you again, Congresswoman, for joining today and sharing your perspectives.
Thank you.
So I actually want to kick things off by asking you to sort of take your hat off as Congresswoman for a moment and instead put your hat on as college president, as someone who has been in the driver's seat before at very large public and private nonprofit institutions. If you were a college president right now having to manage this situation, what are the top 2 or 3 things that would be running through your head right now as you look ahead to the 2021 academic year and beyond?
Safety. How to protect our students and our faculty and staff would be my #1 priority. How can we continue our core responsibilities but protect the health of the people that work, live, and study in our institutions? So I would start by thinking about what our core business is and how we can keep people safe. And whatever structural changes are required, whatever process changes are required, all of that has to be around a safety ring.
Great. Yeah, I think that certainly safety is the number one issue, that it's hard to grapple with how that's going to play out in the fall. So shifting gears back to present day, first, I want to say congratulations on your recent appointment by Speaker Nancy Pelosi to serve on the bipartisan Congressional Oversight Commission to oversee implementation of the $2 trillion economic relief package that was passed as part of the CARES Act. In general, can you provide a little bit of oversight or just background on, what will be the primary focus of the commission when it comes to oversight of these funds?
Well, it's oversight of the role of the Fed and the Treasury in basically helping the larger corporations, as well as state and local governments, to survive, basically using loans. But we're going to ask a couple of questions. Number one question is, who did they give the money to, and what did the companies do with the money? Did they protect their employees? I'm fundamentally interested in keeping as many employees tied to their companies and making sure that they have income to support their families. I'm not interested at all in executives, in buybacks, or executives getting more money during this pandemic. In fact, I think everybody should be taking a cut in pay, particularly these multi-million-dollar packages that people have. But the most important thing is to protect employees as a way of bolstering the economy.
Great, thank you. So looking more specifically now to higher education, we know that the sector has already rightfully received over $14 billion through the CARES Act. But there was some criticism about how that formula allocated funding to institutions, with some smaller private schools, for example, getting more money than community colleges. I know the House's recent passage of the HEROES Act did make some changes to that formula to ensure that schools that serve a greater share of part-time students, like community colleges, actually receive a fairer allocation of federal dollars than what was in the CARES Act. But what are some of the other big priorities for the House or Congress in general when it comes to providing additional relief to institutions across all sectors?
Well, first of all, we want to know where our students are. And the vast majority of students in this country are adults and they commute. And a very high percentage are already working, if they're working now. So we have to think about the students that we're trying to help, and understand that higher education is no longer, and hasn't been for a long time, a traditional four-year college with a graduate school tacked on. So we've got to pay attention to community college, to historic Black colleges, but we have to be careful that we're not underwriting these fly-by-night proprietary institutions, which I've been on the warpath at, who have been ripping off students for a very long period of time, and whom the Secretary of Education seems to love. So we put another almost $11 billion in the HEROES Act for higher education, with a particular interest in community colleges.
Great, thank you. And sort of related to, you sort of touched on this a little bit, what should the federal government then be doing to ensure that colleges themselves, whether they're community colleges or any of the other ones that are receiving some of this funding, what should they be doing to ensure that colleges will use their stimulus money to best support students? What in your opinion, are some of the best uses of those funds?
Well, the most helpful things is when the colleges focus on their lowest income students. Those are the ones that we have to help. I also want them to focus on the seniors. I want them to get people graduated. So the rate of progress ought to be important to us on getting students through. And it's going to have to be a combination of things. Colleges are going to be very imaginative about a combination of in-class plus some online to reduce the kind of exposure that students must have. But we're going to have to monitor this very carefully. We're going to have lots of oversight. Look, some money is going to filter through to the wrong places. You expect that. When you're dealing in billions of dollars, you expect a certain amount of that, but you want it as targeted as possible.
Thank you. So you alluded to Secretary DeVos already, but we've already seen that Secretary DeVos's original guidance to institutions on how they can disperse emergency financial aid grants to students has caused some confusion among who can receive this aid, including intentionally excluding DACA students from this provision. What additional clarity or oversight does Congress need to consider in its next round of funding to ensure that money is spent as intended by Congress and is allocated to the students who need it most?
You know, it's very important that we do that. And we're going to have to write in more specifics, probably in the appropriations bills, to make sure that we cover the DACA students. It's interesting. I was talking to the president of the University of Washington, and what they did in the first tranche of money, because it was focused on low-income students, but not on students that were undocumented, and they raised private money to make sure those students were well taken care of. Every university can't do that. But they were so committed to their entire student body, they made sure that everybody got some help.
Great. So you already also alluded a little bit now to sort of the predatory institutions. And, you know, if those of us who have followed past recessions know that predatory institutions can and will take advantage of vulnerable Americans who are going to be looking to reskill right now. So what populations in particular are you most worried about as we think about these predatory actors, especially in an online environment?
I'm worried about African Americans, I'm worried about Hispanics, I'm worried about military people and ex-military people, because those are the groups that they prey upon.
Great. And what in particular can Congress do at this moment to protect them?
Well, if I had my way, they wouldn't get public money at all. I mean, my view is if you're a for-profit business, we ought to stop short and think about whether you need subsidies at all. But they're going to get something. They now are eligible for Pell Grants, but I think we have to hold them accountable for real degrees. The Secretary is unwilling to do that, so that we have to limit the kind of financial aid that they can get. Their behavior has just been unacceptable.
So speaking of online education in particular, we know, of course, that every student in the country has already been shifted into an online world, and some institutions are, you know, better prepared or poised to operate in that environment. But what should students and families right now be looking for as some colleges decide to potentially stay online for the fall and potentially longer?
Well, I think they have to look at the quality of that online education. I think most colleges are going to try to do a little bit of a mix. They may be online for the fall, or they may bring their students back, have less in class and more online. So they may take a course online, but the rest of their classes may be in class. I think we're going to do more outdoors. I think we're going to teach outdoors. I've taught outdoors for years because I've been at Wisconsin, which has wonderful weather until you get to winter, and also at the University of Miami, where you can teach all outside all year except when it rains. Colleges are looking for bigger spaces so they can space students out. They're also making decisions about getting the school year done before Thanksgiving so the students don't have to come back. So there's a lot of real thinking going on. They're talking to hotels in their community about larger spaces to teach classes, particularly when they're within walking distance. So I think colleges are thinking through how they would do their curriculum. And they also, for the first time, have senior faculty that have learned about online teaching. And you can do lots of lectures online. What you can't, you can certainly use Zoom and all WebEx and everything else for some interaction. But at the end of the day, as much as possible, we want to get the students back on campus, even with social distancing. so that they can interact with their faculty members and with each other.
Great. So if, however, though, I know the CSU system, for example, has already made the decision that they will remain online, and it's likely that others may follow suit, what can we measure, or how can we measure institutional or instructional quality in an online setting? Sort of thinking back to your college administrator days, what are the things people should look for?
We've been doing that for years. We can measure the quality, and accrediting agencies have been measuring testing students and measuring quality for a long time. You miss that human touch, but you know, the screens are so good these days. I've always done group discussions online in addition to large lecture classes, because I found it much more appealing. I've used blogs over the years and lots of technology. So there are ways of doing it. But to the extent that we can eventually use our campuses with social distancing, we've got to do a mixture. And I think what you're going to see in the fall is not a mishmash, but a mixture depending on the college setting and what their ability to deliver education is.
Great. And just a friendly reminder, I'm getting some great questions here on the chat. So if you have other questions, please feel free to submit them. I'll get to them very shortly. So just related to this, since we're talking about online education in particular, do you think there's anything in particular the federal government should be doing different to monitor the online landscape to make sure that students and taxpayers are getting what they're paying for? Or do you think that some of the general quality guidelines that we already have in place are sufficient to cover online and in-person education?
I don't know the answer to that question, because we're going to have to develop a series of research projects to actually measure quality, online quality. We've done some, but I think we're actually going to have to allocate some money for major research in this area. I don't think we know all the answers yet, and I would be very reluctant for the federal government to do very detailed regulations in this area, as opposed to leaving it to the accreditation people that are going to have to think through a different mix when they do accreditation. I've chaired a lot of accreditation committees over the years for different sizes of institutions, and some of them had online programs at the same time. It's very difficult to put together a panel with experienced online people when you're putting together one of these accreditation things, because there's going to be a much bigger group. But I actually think we need to go out and do a lot more research before we can specifically answer that question. And I certainly wouldn't put rules in place until we have that research. Now, in some areas, we know what the standard is, because in nursing, you have to take a test to be able to get into nursing. In medicine, you have to take tests. So in certain professions, you're going to have to pass the same kinds of tests at the same level. But we've also got to make sure that people get their clinical work in at the same time.
Right. There's a question here from Danielle McLean. How do you balance colleges coming back in the fall and concerns surrounding liability? Could Congress impose liability protections without giving blanket protections to students or preventing students and faculty from suing? And in your opinion, what would that look like?
You know, I think it's very difficult for the federal government to do liability protection. It's basically tort is a state function. So it's hard, and there's all sorts of discussions going on about liability. If the federal government has a very high standard for businesses coming back, for higher education coming back, that includes testing and contact tracing and isolation, and if you put these things in place, you're basically protected from suit. And in states like mine, which have a lot of litigation, it will be tricky. But only the state can really do enough liability. But I'm not in favor of liability protection, just blanket unless people are meeting the CDC guidelines. And right now, no one's meeting the CDC guidelines because no one has their cases going down for 14 days. And frankly, if they have that done in Iowa and they don't have it done in Florida, what goes on in Iowa doesn't stay in Iowa, what goes on in Florida doesn't stay in Florida. So until the country has its arms around this, I think it's going to be very difficult. All we can do is test, do contact tracing, social distancing, make sure people wash their hands, and sanitize all of our places, including all of our public bathrooms.
Thank you. Another question here from Ali Cachavella. Many students have not received funds nor communication about the process and are struggling to meet their basic needs. What advice do you have for students to access emergency aid that they need?
You know, they ought to be contacting their institutions. Institutions, for the most part, do have a way of students to communicate, and they ought not to be shy about communicating directly with the institutions. They ought to get on the websites, find out what the call-in number is or the text number is, and get in touch with the institution. And if they're not getting responses, they ought to call their local congressional office. We're answering calls every day from people that aren't getting answers, whether it's unemployment or whether it's student aid. We're all responding fairly quickly.
Great. So another question from me. Before the pandemic began, a lot of us in the advocacy space had hopes that an HEA reauthorization could actually happen this Congress. As you know, the House was advancing the College Affordability Act. We knew that there were actual conversations happening behind closed doors in the Senate Help Committee. From your vantage point, do you think there's still any room for an HEA to pass in this Congress or perhaps in the next?
The problem is that the Senate wants to do a narrow bill and we want to do a big bill. So either we're going to go to conference and negotiate that out. Do I think there's hope of getting a bill this fall? I think there is. There's a lot of hope, depending on the election, of getting it done next year.
Correct. And so relatedly, you know, if a bigger comprehensive package ends up being off the table this Congress, do you think that perhaps there are one or two other bills or things that would be in perhaps a slimmed down version that might actually be able to advance this Congress? And if so, you know, do you have any thoughts on what you would like to see get through this Congress, even if it's not a full package?
Well, I'd like to streamline the Pell Grant process, the application. I'd like to make it easier. The idea of collecting people's tax information every year is just onerous to low-income families. And we need to make that process simpler, more straightforward. So there's some things like that that we need to do. And obviously, we've been fighting with Secretary DeVos, so there are other things we'd like to do to protect disabled students and students of color and make sure the money is targeted appropriately and taking off against the proprietary institutions that are bad actors. So there are a lot of things we'd like to put in a higher education bill. We don't particularly like what she's done on sexual harassment and on those cases. We may have to do something on for college sports to maintain our commitment to women's sports. These court cases may force us to do something in that area, whether that be included in the higher education bill or it be an independent bill. I can't give you an answer to that question, but we do have a big bill. We'd love to pass it, but I'm not quite sure whether the Senate's going to be willing to do that.
Great. So thank you to everyone. I'm getting a lot of really great questions in here. This one is from Cody Impton. The HEROES Act states the following, that a state's application shall include assurances that the state will maintain state support for higher education. not including support for capital projects or for research and development or tuition and fees paid by students. Could you expand a little bit more on what that provision is saying here, and or your thoughts on making sure that state funding and disinvestment isn't an inevitable outcome from this looming recession?
Well, I think that what that provision does is recognize the state's been pulling their money out of higher education for a long time. And if we're going to give them federal money, more federal money, we're not going to let them continue to do that. They're going to have to do, they're going to have to maintain their level of support to get the federal money. Federal money is not going to be substitutional. We've got to stop this slide taking money away from higher education in the states. That said, we're going to be giving the states a lot of money, as well as local governments. To the extent that local governments contribute to community colleges, very few do. Well, New York does, I think. So we want to make sure that when the federal government money comes in, that the states don't believe that they can cut higher education, use the federal money just as a substitute.
Great. Another question. We've seen a lot of the gaps in equity and inclusion laid bare by the pandemic. As we move into recovery policies and look towards the post-pandemic future of higher ed, are there any plans to rethink policies regarding equity and inclusion?
Yeah, the answer is yes. If my party was in charge, we would probably double the Pell Grants. That is, we do not believe that free college tuition is the answer alone, that it has to include all the support systems that low-income students and minority students need at the same time. So we would do a lot more in that area. Now, the healthcare system is the other issue, because what it has laid bare is the fragmentation of the healthcare system, the fact that so many people lack health insurance, or at least access to good healthcare. And that ought to be one of our goals at the same time, universal healthcare of some kind.
Correct, yeah. Another question, when you consider the economic impact of FIU, Florida International University, Miami-Dade, and the University of Miami, they collectively rank among the biggest industry or sector in Miami. So can you just talk a little bit more about how Congress or the administration or even the governor is, appreciating that fact, or what sort of intersection people are seeing between institutions of higher education and the broader economic recovery of their city or state or even the country?
Well, these institutions across the country have been the hardcore mainstays of economies. You can see the small college towns across the country really being in economic distress. It's not just Miami that's in economic distress because we have this hospitality industry that has been devastated, but small town America with one college where they're the major employer. It's also like the prison system. If you have a prison in your community, they're the major employer. But higher education has long been the major employer in communities across the country. And its economic impact, because of its purchasing power, because of its employment, because of its high salaries, relative high salaries in communities, because of the $15 an hour effort to get salaries up, has been an important economic engine. And for Miami, which I describe as a college town, it has been critical. And so whatever investments we can do to maintain that, but more importantly, to make sure that young people have opportunities for the future, absolutely critical to bringing back the economy. But we have to do it safely.
Yeah. So in the midst of everything else happening, it is hard to believe that there is a major election that is happening this November. In a normal election year, we know that legislating typically slows down in the months leading up to the election, but this is not a normal year. And so how do you think Congress will deal with campaigning while still trying to help the country recover?
I think we're going to do both. I think that most members of Congress will tell you that they've never worked this hard because we don't get breaks. We don't get to walk over to the Capitol and spend 30 minutes voting. It's Zoom, 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 literally.
Yeah.
Backed up. We're meeting with our constituencies. We're answering phones. We're trying to help people in our community. We're almost local, really local government officials. This is retail politics. So the incumbents are going to have an advantage in this election because we're so visible in our communities. And there's just an advantage because it's not political at all. I was out this morning doing two things. We just opened a walk-in center for testing in one of our low-income neighborhoods where people don't have cars. So they're getting testing today at one of our community health centers. Is running a big testing regime. And second, I delivered meals from one of the best restaurants in Miami, Joe's Stone Crab, to the nurses on the COVID-19 unit at Mercy Hospital.
That's great. That also sounds delicious. I'm sure they really enjoyed that. Another question, the state of Maryland was able to sign into law a provision that closes the 90-10 loophole, which for those who may be less familiar, essentially allows GI money to not count so that, predatory institutions oftentimes target veterans for their GI Bill dollars. Since the federal government hasn't been able to yet close that loophole itself, do you think, in your opinion, other states should be following Maryland's lead and sort of have a 50-state approach on this? Or do you have hope that the federal government or Congress could actually address closing the 90-10 loophole, either this Congress or the next?
I think the next Congress, depending on whether the Democrats win both houses. If we win the Senate, we have the votes to close that loophole. We actually have the votes in the House to close the loophole. And we have Republican votes to close the loophole because it has preyed particularly on the military. And so there's a lot of support. The Defense Department supports closing the loophole, the Pentagon. So there's building up support for that. But I think we were going to have to wait for the next Congress. I've put in 80-20 where I could.
Great. How should we support the approximately 25% of higher ed students who are also parents? The increase in distance learning could help with some flexibility there, but the lack of childcare and the limited reach of programs like C Campus can also present major challenges. What are your thoughts specifically about the student-parent demographic?
I don't see how we get back to work without childcare. And I don't see how we do childcare without social distancing of some kind or another. And a number of us has been looking at different ways, and we obviously have to get the schools open, elementary and secondary, middle schools. We've got to get them open, particularly the elementary and the middle schools. We have to get them open as quickly as possible, or people can't go back to work. I mean, it's as simple and straightforward as that people are not going to be able to go back to work unless we get these places open. Childcare is going to be very tricky. There's some institutional childcare in higher education. Most of the big institutions have childcare centers on site. We do at the University of Miami. We did at the University of Wisconsin. We did at Hunter. I gave up my own office at Hunter to establish a childcare center for basically parents that were coming to class. And we're trying to finish up. So we've got to get childcare off the ground. There's just no question about it. But we're going to have to rethink childcare. I've been looking at the European experience, Scandinavian experience. They do their childcare outdoors. We tend to do our childcare indoors with outdoor play. It could be that we've got to teach outdoors and bring the kids in a limited way indoors. Kids that learn outdoors have less infections than kids that learn indoors, because indoor childcare centers are petri, as any parent knows, their kid gets a cold, everybody in the family gets a cold. Everybody in the child care center has a cold. So there are things that we can do. And the Scandinavians, even in the dead of winter, have the kids taking naps on cots outside. Mm-hmm. The University of Washington has an outdoor child care program 4 hours a day that they run in their arboretum. They just don't have the number of infectious diseases because they're outdoors. So we have to figure out some way to get the kids out of buildings if we're going to spread them out. But the big challenge is no one has the space to do much more than take maybe 25 to 50% of the kids. They can't make any money that way. I mean, they can't cover their costs that way. Mm-hmm. The same as restaurants. I was amused, not very amused, that the restaurants are opening across the country at 25% capacity. What restaurant can make money to cover their costs at 25% capacity? Schools and childcare centers in particular have the same challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm a mother of a 17-month-old, so I'm highly aware of the situation. And I know my daughter would love to spend most of her time outside, honestly, at her childcare center.
You know, and a lot of kids miss their childcare.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, they do. And Zoom with a baby just doesn't quite cut it.
No, doesn't cut it.
So a recent survey from the Education Trust found that around 10% of college students of color in particular still do not have the internet enabled that they need in order to participate in online classes. What more can Congress do to ensure that our college students have technology and internet connectivity to continue with their classes? And I think this is fair to expand to the K-12 space as well.
Yeah, you know, we distributed over 110,000 laptops to the kids in Miami-Dade, not the college students, but the kids in the public school system. And we made sure they had an internet connection. We either paid for it or gave them something that would give them an internet connection because we wanted them to be able to continue their education. We have not done that for college students. Mm-hmm. And we may have to do that as part of the package that universities put together. Mm-hmm. In private colleges, most kids come with those laptops. And if they don't, we struggle, but we figure out a way that they can do their homework. And that's what we're going to have to continue to do. But for commuting students and community colleges who have limited internet access, that have to restrict that internet access to their kids who are learning online, mm-hmm. becomes very problematic. So broadband is going to be absolutely critical to us continuing as a nation.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you alluded to HBCUs and MSIs earlier in the conversation, but do you have any thoughts on how we can specifically continue to support HBCUs and MSIs during this crisis, given their vulnerable populations?
Oh, I think we're going to have to put a lot of money into those institutions. We already have and will continue to. They got over $1 billion in the HEROES Act, and they had gotten, I think, 10. Mm-hmm. Maybe 20 in the previous. So we're doing everything we can to maintain them. They're important institutions in our society, and we have a responsibility to help them.
Great. So I think I probably know the answer to this question, but one that was submitted, did you have any correspondence with the Department of Education after it released guidance limiting CARES Act emergency aid grants to Title IV eligible students? And
yes.
As someone who helped, great, and as someone who helped write the legislation, what was your reaction to how the department handled the disbursement of these funds?
I was mortified. Mm-hmm. And yes, the entire committee, I sit on Education and Labor, and we have communicated very clearly to the Secretary. We hope to be able to get her in a hearing.
Great. And then just related to your previous answer here on broadband, another question came in. What do you think is the best federal vehicle to deliver internet-enabled devices and hotspots to low-income students?
Well, I think it has to be through the school districts. I just think that they're closer. We're delivering meals through them. We're delivering laptops through them by giving them resources. So at the end of the day, I think it has to be the school system through the states to the public schools.
Great. So I just want to very quickly, we have about a minute or so left. So last call for any remaining questions that folks can pop into the chat. Another one that I received, going back to sort of thinking about online quality education, somebody notes that the Open SUNY Course Quality Review is a standard rubric for evaluating online courses. Do you think we need research beyond what SUNY has already done to determine what is quality in online courses?
I think the answer to that question will come after we do research in this area. I don't want to second guess. I know we've got some, because of the accreditation agencies and big systems have been working on this for a long time, but we really need to know more about it. And that's why I would call for more research in this area, particularly if it's going to substitute for face-to-face education. We just need to know more about it and how it impacts. We need to know whether low-income students have fallen behind. We know something about the summer melt. What do we know about this melt? The pandemic melt. So there's just a lot of things we need to know, and higher education in particular is going to have to do that research. And we're going to have to provide resources for it.
Great. I think you just coined a new term here, pandemic melt. Okay, I have two more questions and then we will conclude today's discussion. Any thought to automatically enroll students on income-driven repayment plans to avoid defaults when the emergency forbearance period ends, I believe in September?
I actually think we have to extend the emergency forbearance programs. I also think that I'm in favor of a national service corps that will eliminate debt for many of our students in large amounts. And I'm hoping we can pass that bill at some point. Many of us are hot to trot. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I'm hoping that we can do with that. But I do think we should extend forbearance through the fall until next year.
Great. And then the last question, I think this is a really interesting one. As a former college president, are you concerned that higher education has become a partisan issue? What can we do to give, Republicans comfort that we, the person that's asking this question from a higher education institute says that we are not, quote unquote, bastions of liberalism?
Yeah, that's been going on for a long time in higher education. Higher education used to be the Republican social policy. We cared about elementary and secondary and childcare, and they cared about higher education. I worked for a Republican governor in Wisconsin that was very supportive of higher education. And I've worked for Democratic governors too that weren't as supportive of higher education. So I have actually never seen it. The key to it is those who have gotten the education, the alums, sending very clear messages to their state legislators that this is important. And that this is important to the economy. We started out with a question about the economy, about higher education's role in the economy. FIU, Miami-Dade, Florida Memorial, all of the colleges and universities here in Barry and the University of Miami, all of them here are critical to the economy. And they're up and running the way other institutions are not. So they're going to be critical to their investment in the economy. And if you start out that way, then making a bipartisan case. I've never seen higher education as a partisan issue until I met the Secretary of Education. And then she just doesn't believe in higher education unless it's for profit. And she doesn't believe in elementary and secondary unless it's private. So it's just sort of totally weird from my own experience with Republicans in higher education and education in general, because I've never seen these things as partisan at all. And as a college president, I tried to stay really out of politics. I work with both Republicans and Democrats in every state I've been in.
Great. Well, I hope you're right in that we can sort of rise above any.
How did we get through this without talking about football?
I don't know. You want to talk about football?
No, I've been fascinated with the fact that everybody intends to get their football program up and going, which, by the way, I'm in favor of if it can be done safely because it supports all the other sports as well. But also our communities need something to focus on other than COVID-19. So if we can get our sports programs up and going, but not at the expense of stopping young people who don't have the resources or the same opportunity. But it's what higher education in America has always had, this kind of mix of things that other people have never had. And we've reached deeper into our populations. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I know you'll continue to have your work cut out for you in the coming months, and we really thank you for your dedication to making sure students can continue to get the education they need in this difficult time.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks so much, and we'll look forward to chatting again soon.
Terrific.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.